Okay, let's take a look at a couple of examples. The first is an example of an assignment. This example involves Joe, who is the landlord, renting an apartment to Mary, the tenant, for 1 year. Mary is a student and really only needs the apartment for 9 months because she's going to go back home after the school year. Mary works out a situation to sublet the apartment to Susan, who will take over the apartment for the last 3 months. Susan will move in and pay the rent until the lease is over. So if you're using the handout that was provided to you in the assignment folder, you know that the first thing you have to do is figure out who the players are. So I'm just going to go through and highlight everybody that's involved. So I see that there is a landlord, it was Joe. Let's see, he's renting to Mary, who we know is the tenant. And then there's a sublet going on to Susan. So we have Joe, Mary, and Susan. Once you figure out who the players are, the next step is to, or identify the players, the next step is to identify who's in privity of contract. So who has the direct contractual relationship. Here, Joe is the landlord, and he is in contract with Mary, who is the tenant. Later, Mary adds Susan to this scenario to sublet. So she's going to be the sub-leasee, actually, but I'm just going to write sublet. So Joe and Mary are in privity of contract. Susan is a third party who's involved. The next step is, when did this happen? When did the third party get involved in this relationship? So if you just think about it practically, Joe and Mary had to set up a contract that spelled out all the terms of the lease. And we know that it was for 1 year. So they're finished. After the formation of this contract, so 9 months down the road, Mary brings Sue into this relationship. So Sue comes in after. So we know, using this handout, that if Sue becomes involved after, it's either going to be an assignment or delegation. So then you have to look at actually what's going on. What kind of transfer are you dealing with? Here we're dealing with a transfer of rights, because factually what's going to happen is Sue is going to come in, or Susan's going to come in and take over the lease for the last 3 months. So she's going to move in, pay rent, and so Mary's rights to the apartment are being transferred. So an assignment is a transfer of rights and that's what you have going on here. Most contracts can be assigned. In your handout notes the exceptions, and the effect of this type of relationship, that is the law here, is that the assignee, that's what Susan is, will stand in the shoes of the assignor, and Susan will now have contractual rights under this contract. And likewise, Joe has contractual obligations. Now, the only way that this wouldn't happen is if there was something in this original contract that would prohibit this transfer of rights. So what Joe would have to do is specifically include an anti-assignment clause or an approval clause, which says he could that Susan could only come in if he agreed to it. So this is an example of an assignment. Next, we're going to take a look at a delegation example. In this example, Bob contracts with a developer, the development company, to build him a house. Bob works with the company to get the model and all the specifics for the house worked out, and he's expecting it's going to take about 3 months before the house will be ready for him to move in. The development company hires independent contractors to help them build the various stages of the house. And in our example, we're going to look at the framing of the house, which is being done by Framers Incorporated. So the first step is to figure out what's going on, who are the players in this situation. So we have Bob, who's the buyer. We have the development company, who's going to be responsible for building the house. And then we have Framers Incorporated. The next step is to figure out who is in the direct relationship, so who's in privity of contract. Here we have Bob, who's your buyer, working with the development company. And they get into a contract and figure out what type of house is going to be built. So these two are in the direct relationship. They are in privity of contract. Next, you have the development company hiring out to Framers Incorporated to do the framing. So essentially, there is a separate contract here. So we have another agreement whereby the framers are going to frame the house. So they are going to perform some of the duties that the development company has undertaken with the buyer. So the next question is, when did the framers, who are our third parties, come into the contract? And here it's pretty straightforward. You can see that the contract was in place between Bob and the developer. And then after the formation of this contract, the third party was brought in. So if you go back to your chart, you see that you're on this side. So it's after formation. And here we're looking at a transfer of duties. So this is the transfer of duties to perform, which is part of building the house. And that is a delegation. So when you have a delegation, it's important to remember that most contracts may be delegated. There's only a few exceptions, and that's when they involve personal service contracts, calling for the exercise of personal skills, discretion, or expertise. You also can't delegate when the delegation would materially vary the contract. But outside of those circumstances, most contracts can be delegated. If the parties in the original contract don't want a delegation to take place, they need to include an anti-delegation clause at the onset of their creation of their contract.